On the 8th of June, a United Nations court upheld the conviction of Bosnian Serb military chief and war criminal Ratko Mladic for genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes committed during the Bosnian War. The International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals at The Hague rejected Mladic's appeal and thus confirmed his life sentence. Now, world leaders reacted, differently to the sentencing, or rather the conviction of Mladic, welcoming the conclusion of the 9-year-old court case against him, with U.S. President Joe Biden stating that the final judgment shows that those who committed horrific crimes will be held accountable and reinforces our shared resolve to prevent future atrocities from occurring anywhere in the world. Now, I'm, of course, reading and quoting from an article published and penned by Ismail Cilic and Alma Begic regarding the conviction of Ratko Mladic and the reaction of the world community, or the leaders in the world community, towards his, towards that particular judgment. Joining me this evening is Alma Begic, who has earned her graduate degree from the Syracuse University in political science and international relations, currently a consultant at one of the world's leading professional service firms, joining us live from North Carolina in the U.S. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Alma.
Alaikum assalam.
Sister Alma, shukran, jazakumullah khairan, and thank you so much for joining us. Ratko Mladic, sentenced a month ago. Is this the end of the case or the story for him, or has he got any opportunity to appeal in the future?
Thank you for having me in the program. So legally, yes, this is the end of the road for Ratko Mladic. The UN court responsible for the Mladic trial, as you had alluded to at the beginning of the program, has upheld his conviction of a life sentence. However, we have to remember that both the ideologue, Mladic himself, and the ideology lives on. In prison, Mladic will have ample opportunity to sit, write, and produce literature that will act as guidance, inspiration for generations of Serbs to come. In fact, in previous years, he's been able to be part of different Serb political media outlets, calling into radio and television, calling in for radio and television interviews. There have been issues. There have been things put in place for him not to be able to do that moving forward, but he'll be able to continue to write and produce an opus that will surely be published and will surely be read in the decades to come.
Alma, many in the West consider that justice has been served. They see an individual who's well into, his life. It's been many years since the Bosnian War. Mm-hmm. I mean, over 20 years or so. And many people, the younger generation, those that have moved to the U.S. and other parts of the world, be it in Europe or even stayed in Bosnia for that matter, well, their memories of the Bosnian War are not as vivid and clear as those who are of the senior and older generation, who, as expected in time, will now pass on. Have Western leaders at this point in time taken the opportunity to close the curtain, even prematurely, on the Bosnian conflict? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd like to answer that question in two parts. So for those who are older, who actually remember and have gone through the atrocities of the war, they still live in the communities with the perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So imagine a world in which you go out to eat at a restaurant and sitting at the table next to you is a neighbor who raped a cousin or a niece who is an adult now but with a child then. This is the reality of those living in the Republika Srpska today, which is the Serb-controlled autonomous entity that accounts for 49% of Bosnia's territory established by the Dayton Peace Accords. For the younger generation, they lived effects of the war every day, right? So the political establishments that they have inherited, the fact of the ethnic politics, the social, political, economic stagnation of the state, the fact the tripartite presidency, everything that impacts their everyday lives, they still continue to live the effects of the war today. For the diaspora, as you mentioned, the young people who have now either been, born or raised in part in the United States or Europe or in other countries of the world, it's a fact of life as well, right? They were refugees. They were made to be refugees. And continue to have to grapple with issues related to identity, to their place and their belonging in the world, in a way that their other counterparts, for example, me living in the United States, that my American counterparts do not have to grapple with. I'll say, to conclude that question, just this weekend, I spent time with a group of young, very educated, master's, PhD level educated young Bosnians living in the diaspora today. We spent the entire weekend together. And what was our major topic of discussion for those 2 days? It was the war. It was the effects of that war, and it was how we are living the effects of that war every day and what the future of our country will look like.
Alma, genocide and genocide denial. Look, in the area itself, you have Serbia, then you have a large Serbian population residing in, as you had mentioned, the country of Bosnia. They're not going to go away anytime soon. I mean, they've been there for decades, sometimes centuries, neighbors, living as neighbors, and prior to the war, and even before that, there have been genocidal issues and tendencies amongst population groups, be it the Croats, etc. Is there this acceptance amongst the Serbian population that we did wrong, that a genocide has occurred, Serbs were responsible for it, we are remorseful, we are repentful, and we want to move on? I mean, other countries have done so. You had colonial entities, the Netherlands, etc., who owned up. France is currently owning up, for genocide that they may have committed, in Algeria, etc. Do you see this type of remorse amongst young Serbians?
The short answer, absolutely not. There are individuals, there are brave individuals, mostly young people in their 30s, some in their late 20s, 30s, early 40s, individual journalists who write and speak out and try to hold their own establishment, their own political establishment to account. But those are very few and very far between, and often they are silenced, they are forced to flee the country, they're exiled, they are really stamped out by their own community. But in reality, not a single member of the Bosnian Serb political elite, so those are the Serbs that have been born and raised and live on the territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina, or the greater Serbian political establishment, so we're talking about our neighbor Serbia, has recognized the genocide or the war crimes against humanity, the atrocities committed on the territory and the sovereign territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Hence, the rhetoric of genocide denial, of historical revisionism, and even of the story of a centuries-long persecution and Serb victimization. And this actually, the 1990s being a kind of retribution or revenge for things that have happened, these mythical or mystical things that have happened hundreds of years ago, continue to be the general rhetoric, the general ideology of the Serbian people, particularly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they come from the very top.
Alma, finally, I mean, we could talk about this for a long, long time, and I want to thank you for your time and for your. We don't often get an opportunity to speak on the Bosnian War and the aftermaths thereof. I mean, maybe once in a while when the actual anniversary comes along. But I wanted to ask you that many communities, like for example the Palestinian communities, with whatever they are facing in recent years, they have done, I would say, a good job in promoting their plight or in creating awareness regarding their plight. You have the younger generation who have taken to social media that whilst issues happen on the ground, informing the rest of the world, not just the Muslim world, but the greater humanitarian world that responds. They may not be able to respond militarily, but at the very least they will respond in other ways, showing a sense of empathy. This generation of Bosnians, maybe your generation, maybe the generation that exists who are now currently in their 20s and 30s, have they galvanized their resources to a point of them being able to present the Bosnian case that by no means is over? Although the war is over, the threat of Serb domination and a repeat of 1990s still continues to exist. Yes,
that's very true. There are efforts. I'll say that progress has been made. We have to remember that this is, for Bosnia and Herzegovina, really, I'll say, if there is ever a silver lining, and there's not very many silver linings, but if there's a silver lining of the war, it's that a generation, we're finally seeing the first generations en masse of Bosnians, of young Bosnians en masse being educated and being educated to higher degrees, right? Receiving their bachelor's, their master's, their PhDs. And so we're seeing the first kind of professional class of people who are coming to grips, right, and having the tools and resources and connections and networks available to them to start to think about how to mobilize. So it's nascent, right? These young generations are just learning. They have no examples in their own. I mean, they have from other, the Palestinian cause, and there, but no examples in our own communities of how to do this type of activism. And so we are coming together little by little in little groups. But unfortunately, as you alluded to earlier, one of the biggest challenges that we face as a community is the very fact that young generations are not being taught what happened and why they are where they are. So many parents do not want to talk about the traumas. They don't want to relive the traumas that they had actually lived through, and therefore choose to raise their children who maybe came here, went to the United States or went to Europe, or even live within Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is really interesting. They choose not to talk to them about the reality of what actually occurred and what happened in the 1990s. And so they're growing up in a vacuum, not really understanding why today they have the political and social system that they have, except to know there was a war and, well, we need to move on, right? So I'll say we're trying. It's nascent. We're growing, but it's not there yet, and it's nowhere near the galvanization of the Palestinian cause.
Alma, how is the link between the recent immigrants from Bosnia to those who continue to remain? You live in a community which there's plenty diasporas within that community. You've got the Pakistani community, the Indian, the Arabs, the Palestinians. Somehow many of them, I would say many from South Asia in particular, do maintain some sort of a cultural, social, family link to people who are back home through marriage and through communication and through regular visits. Does this exist, with your generation of Bosnians that, they're keen to know how the folks are doing back home? They're keen to maybe learn their language, their culture. There's a sense of socialization, maybe even intermarriage for that matter, amongst those who are back home. How does it work?
Yeah, we absolutely still do. And that's one of the positives, I think, of the Bosnian diaspora is that, if we look at the American and European diaspora, Very often, our parents, the one thing, if they did not talk about the war, what they did do is try to preserve the language and the culture, and so they would bring their children back to Bosnia during summer holidays to the point of what they could, to the extent of what they could afford. In terms of the link today between kind of the motherland, the homeland, and the diaspora itself, I think that the diaspora, for the vast majority of people, has kind of established their lives now wherever they are starting to move forward. For the most part, they're still intermarrying. So, if someone came to the United States at 5, 6, or 7 years old, they will often marry somebody who has had that same journey, another Bosnian who has had that same journey. There's less intermarriage with, though there's instances of that, there's less intermarriage with those that are actually in Bosnia, which creates another, we actually just discussed this in my own family, which creates another gulf, right? So within Bosnia, those who are in Bosnia, they have a view of the diaspora that, wow, all of these people are successful and how lucky they are to be living outside, right? Having no recognition of the struggles that the diaspora has faced to try to reestablish their lives. Having very little recognition of the fact that these people came to the United States or Europe with no means, no resources, had to work back-breaking physical labor jobs in order to be able to provide a future for their children, whereas the diaspora itself looks upon Bosnia and says, well, these people have absolutely no recognition for our struggles. They just don't understand. They think that we live these lives where it's all, milk and honey. And so a gulf has really developed where it's almost become that it's the same people, but we're becoming more and more like strangers to each other. And there are organizations that are working on that to try to reestablish those links between the diaspora and Bosnia and Herzegovina as the homeland. Progress is being made on that front as well. But as time passes on, we see a greater gulf and a greater integration of Bosnian youth into the communities where they have come to call their home.
Elma Begic, thank you so much for your time once again, and hopefully we'll have a longer conversation sometime in the future about Bosnian-related matters, and have yourself a good rest of your week ahead. Assalamu alaikum.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join your program. Alaikum salam, and have a wonderful evening.